The ballroom glittered with 1,000 tiny lights, reflecting off champagne glasses and designer dresses. Christmas music played softly in the background, the kind of instrumental arrangements that rich people considered festive. But Grace Miller wasn't looking at the decorations or the expensive buffet or the executives networking near the bar. She was looking at the little girl in the red velvet dress, sitting at table 7 with her father, her hands moving in fluid, graceful signs that made Grace's heart stop beating. The girl was laughing, silent laughter, the kind that shakes your shoulders and lights up your whole face. Her father was signing something back to her, his movements careful but unpracticed, and the girl was correcting him with patient amusement, showing him the right way to form the words. And that laugh, that particular way her eyes crinkled at the corners, the way her whole body curved into the joy, was so familiar that Grace had to grip the serving tray harder to keep from dropping it, because she'd seen that laugh before, every single day for 8 years, until the day it stopped forever. But how did a struggling single mom, who could barely afford rent, end up standing in a corporate ballroom, watching a deaf girl sign with her father? And why did seeing that little girl smile feel like being stabbed in the chest with 1,000 memories she'd spent 3 years trying to forget? For days earlier, Grace had been doing math that didn't work. Again, she sat at her kitchen table, the one that wobbled because one leg was shorter than the others, the one she'd bought at a thrift store for $15, and stared at the numbers in her checkbook. Rent was due in 2 days. She had $473. Rent was $850. The gap between those numbers felt like a chasm she couldn't cross. She'd already worked 60 hours this week between her 2 jobs. Mornings at the coffee shop near the business district, evenings doing catering and event service for Sterling Events, a company that handled corporate parties and weddings for people who had money to burn. The catering gig paid better, but it was unpredictable. Some weeks she got 30 hours. Some weeks she got 5. This week had been good. Sterling had 3 events scheduled, including a big corporate Christmas party on Friday. That would give her maybe another $200. Still not enough. Grace pressed her palms against her eyes and tried not to cry. She was so tired. Tired of working constantly and still falling behind. Tired of choosing between groceries and electricity. Tired of living in a studio apartment in a building where the heat barely worked and the neighbors fought at 3 in the morning. Tired of being alone with grief that never quite went away, no matter how many years passed. 3 years. It had been 3 years since Vivian died. 3 years since Grace had held her daughter's hand in a hospital room and watched the machines stop beeping, watched the numbers on the monitors go flat, watched the only person she'd ever loved more than her own life slip away despite every prayer, every bargain with God, every desperate promise Grace had made. Vivian had been born deaf. Complete sensorineural hearing loss, the doctors had explained when Grace was still reeling from new motherhood and the shock of learning her baby couldn't hear her voice. At first, Grace had grieved that too. Grieved the conversations they'd never have, the lullabies Vivian would never hear, all the sounds of the world that would remain silent for her daughter. But then Grace had learned sign language. She'd thrown herself into it with the same fierce dedication she brought to everything involving Vivian. She'd taken classes, joined deaf community groups, practiced until her hands ached and the signs became second nature. And she discovered something beautiful. Vivian didn't need to hear to communicate. Their conversations weren't diminished by silence. They were rich and full and perfect, conducted in graceful movements that felt more intimate than spoken words ever had. Grace had loved signing with her daughter, loved the way Vivian's face lit up when Grace learned a new sign, loved their bedtime stories, told in flickering movements under the nightlight, loved the secret language they shared, the way they could communicate across crowded rooms with just a glance and a gesture. Being Vivian's mother had been the greatest joy of Grace's life. Every single day, even the hard ones, even when money was tight and Grace was exhausted from working multiple jobs as a single mom, had been worth it because of Vivian's smile. And then Vivian had gotten sick. A heart condition, congenital, something that had been lurking undetected since birth. By the time the symptoms appeared, the fatigue, the shortness of breath, the fainting spell that sent them to the emergency room, the damage was already extensive. The doctors had tried everything. Medications, surgeries, experimental treatments that cost more money than Grace could imagine. She'd sold everything she owned, maxed out credit cards, taken loans she'd never be able to repay. Friends and strangers had rallied, organizing fundraisers and donation drives. For a while, it seemed like maybe, they'd have more time. But Vivian's heart had been too damaged, too weak. And 3 weeks after her 9th birthday, surrounded by beeping machines and gentle nurses and a mother who would have traded places with her in a heartbeat, Vivian had died. Grace's world had ended that day. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the quiet, devastating way that grief destroys you from the inside out. She'd gone through the motions of living, worked, ate, slept, paid bills, but nothing felt real anymore. Nothing mattered. She existed in a gray fog where every moment was colored by absence, by the weight of all the conversations she'd never have, all the milestones Vivian would never reach, all the years of life her daughter had been cheated out of. The medical debt had been catastrophic. Even with insurance, even with the fundraising, the bills had been overwhelming. Grace had declared bankruptcy 2 years ago, but it hadn't helped as much as she'd hoped. Some debts couldn't be discharged. Some followed you forever. She'd lost the small apartment she and Vivian had shared. Too many memories there anyway, too painful to stay, and moved into the cheapest place she could find. She'd sold or donated almost everything Vivian had owned, unable to bear looking at her daughter's clothes and toys and books without breaking down. She'd kept 3 things. Vivian's favorite stuffed rabbit, worn soft from years of love. A photo of them together, taken 6 months before Vivian died. Both of them signing, "I love you," at the camera. And Vivian's collection of sign language storybooks, the ones they'd read together every night. Grace couldn't bring herself to part with those. They sat in a box in her closet, too precious to throw away, too painful to look at. Grace hadn't signed with anyone since Vivian's death. She'd withdrawn from the deaf community groups she'd been part of, unable to face the other parents and their living children. She'd avoided situations where she might encounter sign language. She'd built walls around the part of herself that had been Vivian's mother, because acknowledging it hurt too much. It was easier to be just Grace, the woman who worked 2 jobs and barely scraped by, than to be Grace who'd had a daughter and lost her. But now, staring at her checkbook and the impossible math of her life, Grace felt the familiar weight of despair settling over her shoulders. She was drowning, had been drowning for 3 years, and she was so tired of fighting the current. Her phone buzzed. A text from her supervisor at Sterling Events. "Need you Friday night. Big corporate holiday party at the Grand Ballroom. 6 to 11 p.m. $18 per hour plus tips. Confirm." Grace did quick mental math. 5 hours at $18 was $90. Tips at corporate events were usually decent, maybe another 50 if she was lucky. It wasn't enough to close the gap with rent, but it was something. She texted back confirmation and added the shift to her calendar. At least she had work. At least she wasn't completely alone, even if the solitude sometimes felt crushing. At least she was still here, still trying, still putting one foot in front of the other even when she didn't know why anymore. Grace looked at the photo on her phone's lock screen, the one of her and Vivian signing, "I love you." Vivian would be 12 now. Would have been 12. Grace still couldn't get the tense right in her head. Her daughter existed in this strange grammatical limbo, simultaneously present in memory and absent from reality. What would Vivian be like at 12? Would she still love the color purple and strawberry ice cream and those silly joke books for kids? Would she be tall or short, serious or playful? Would she still correct Grace's, signing with patient amusement when Grace got the grammar wrong? Grace would never know. Those questions had no answers, just an endless ache of missing someone who'd been her whole world. She closed the checkbook and got ready for bed. Tomorrow was another shift at the coffee shop, then a wedding reception in the evening. The day after that the same. And Friday. Friday was the corporate Christmas party at the Grand Ballroom. Just another event, another group of wealthy people celebrating while Grace served them drinks and cleared their plates and went home alone to her cold apartment. She had no idea that Friday night would change everything, that walking into that ballroom would crack open every wall she'd built around her grief, that seeing one little girl smile, would bring her entire carefully constructed survival mechanism crashing down. Friday arrived cold and gray, the kind of December evening that promised snow, but hadn't quite delivered. Grace finished her morning shift at the coffee shop exhausted. They'd been slammed with holiday drink orders, every customer wanting elaborate concoctions with extra foam and specific temperatures, and went home for a few hours of rest before the evening event. She set an alarm, lay down on her bed, and immediately fell into the kind of heavy, dreamless sleep that comes from working too many hours on too little rest. The alarm jolted her awake at 4:30. Grace dragged herself to the shower, letting hot water revive her enough to function. She dressed in the standard Sterling Events uniform, black slacks, white button-down shirt, black vest, comfortable shoes. She pulled her hair back into a neat bun, applied minimal makeup, and checked her appearance in the mirror. Professional, presentable, forgettable. Exactly what event staff were supposed to be. She arrived at the Grand Ballroom at 5:45, 15 minutes early, because she couldn't afford to lose this job by being late. The venue was already transformed into a winter wonderland. White lights were draped everywhere, reflecting off silver and crystal decorations. Enormous Christmas trees flanked the entrance, decorated in corporate colors, blue and silver. Tables were set with elegant place settings, and a stage at one end of the room held a podium and what looked like equipment for presentations. The event coordinator, a perpetually stressed woman named Michelle, was directing setup with the intensity of a battlefield general. She spotted Grace and waved her over. "Grace, thank you for being on time. We're expecting about 200 guests tonight. This is Hartman Technology's annual holiday party. Their CEO is very particular about service quality, so I need everyone on their A game. You'll be working the floor, drinks, clearing plates, making sure guests have what they need. Questions?" "No, ma'am," Grace said. "Just another corporate party. Just another night of smiling and serving and being invisible." Guests started arriving at 6. They came in waves, executives in expensive suits, their spouses or partners dressed in cocktail attire. Everyone laughing and greeting each other with the forced enthusiasm of co-workers who were required to socialize. Grace moved through the crowd with practiced efficiency, offering champagne from silver trays, directing people to the coat check, answering questions about the evening schedule. She was refilling a buffet table when she first saw him. Tall, probably late 30s, wearing a perfectly tailored suit that somehow looked uncomfortable on him. He had the slightly harried expression of someone who'd rather be anywhere else, and he was signing to someone just out of Grace's line of sight. Grace's hands froze on the serving tongs. Signing. He was signing. Her heart started beating faster, that old familiar response to seeing her language, Vivian's language, in the wild. She hadn't seen anyone sign in 3 years. She'd actively avoided it, changed routes to dodge deaf community centers, looked away when she spotted signing conversations on the street. And now, at a corporate Christmas party, where she was supposed to be invisible and professional, someone was signing right in front of her. The man moved slightly, and Grace saw who he was talking to. A little girl, maybe 11 or 12, wearing a red velvet dress that looked expensive and slightly uncomfortable. She was signing back to him, her movements fluid and natural in a way his weren't. As Grace watched, the girl corrected the man's hand position for a sign, showing him the proper formation with patient emphasis. He tried again, got it right, and the girl smiled. Grace's breath caught in her throat. That smile, the way the girl's whole face lit up, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners, the way joy seemed to radiate from her entire body. Grace had seen that exact smile 1,000 times. On Vivian's face, when Grace got a sign right after struggling with it. When they shared a joke in their private language. When Vivian was happy and safe and alive. For a moment, Grace couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything except stare at this little girl who reminded her so painfully of her daughter. They didn't look identical. This girl had darker hair, a different face shape, but something about her energy, her presence, the way she moved through the world, was so familiar it hurt. "Grace," Michelle's sharp voice cut through her paralysis. "The buffet needs attention. Focus, please." Grace shook herself, forced her hands to work, finished arranging the serving dishes. But her eyes kept drifting back to the man and the little girl as they made their way through the crowd. They were greeted warmly by other guests, and Grace realized the man must be important. Probably an executive. Maybe even the CEO Michelle had mentioned. People kept approaching him, shaking his hand, making conversation. The little girl stayed close to his side, watching the conversations with interested eyes, even though she couldn't hear them. The man introduced his daughter to everyone they talked to. Grace couldn't hear the words from across the room, but she could see his pride, his protectiveness, the way he kept one hand on the girl's shoulder like an anchor. A single father and his deaf daughter, navigating a corporate event together. Grace felt tears prick at her eyes and blinked them back furiously. She couldn't fall apart. Not here. Not at work. Dinner service began, and Grace focused on doing her job. Clearing plates, refilling water glasses, making sure guests had everything they needed. She deliberately avoided the table where the man and his daughter sat, assigned herself to the opposite side of the ballroom. But she couldn't stop herself from glancing over, from watching the way the girl signed to her father throughout dinner, from seeing the obvious bond between them. After dinner, there were speeches. The CEO, Grace learned his name was Nathan Hartman, founder of Hartman Technologies, worth probably more money than Grace would earn in 10 lifetimes, took the stage and thanked his employees for another successful year. Grace was clearing tables in the back of the room, trying not to listen too closely, when she realized Nathan was also signing his speech. He wasn't fluent. His signs were careful, deliberate, clearly learned rather than native. But he was doing it, signing his entire speech, so his daughter could understand it, even though everyone else in the room could hear his voice. The effort was obvious, and so was the love behind it. Grace felt something break inside her chest. This man, this wealthy CEO with his successful company and his comfortable life, was doing what Grace had done every day for 8 years, learning a new language for his daughter, making sure she was included, understood, valued, being the kind of parent who put his child's needs ahead of his own comfort. Vivian would have loved a father like that. But Vivian's father had left when Grace was 6 months pregnant, unwilling to deal with the challenges of a deaf child. It had been just Grace and Vivian against the world, and Grace had tried so hard to be enough, to be mother and father both, to give Vivian everything she needed despite the money struggles and the exhaustion and the constant worry. And she'd failed. She'd worked herself to the bone trying to afford Vivian's medical care, and it hadn't been enough. Vivian had died anyway. All Grace's love, all her effort, all her desperate determination to save her daughter, none of it had mattered in the end. Grace realized she was crying, silent tears running down her face, while she stood in the back of a ballroom full of strangers, holding a tray of empty glasses, watching a father sign to his daughter, and feeling like her heart was being ripped out all over again. She set down the tray and escaped to the kitchen, mumbling something about needing a break. In the staff bathroom, she locked herself in a stall and tried to pull herself together. This was ridiculous. She was at work. She couldn't fall apart because she'd seen a deaf girl who reminded her of Vivian. That wasn't fair to anyone, not to herself, not to her employer, not to that innocent child who had nothing to do with Grace's grief. But knowing it was irrational didn't make it hurt less. Grace cried quietly into her hands, trying to muffle the sounds, trying to breathe through the pain that felt as fresh as if Vivian had died yesterday instead of 3 years ago. After 10 minutes, she cleaned her face, fixed her makeup as best she could, and returned to work. The speeches were over. Guests were mingling, networking, enjoying dessert and coffee. Grace moved through the room mechanically, her professional mask firmly in place, even though she felt hollow inside. She was clearing dessert plates from table 7, the table she'd been avoiding all night, when she heard it. Laughter. Silent, joyful laughter that made no sound but was somehow the loudest thing in the room. Grace looked up and saw Nathan's daughter laughing at something her father had signed, her whole body shaking with mirth, her eyes crinkled with happiness. That laugh. That exact expression. Vivian used to laugh like that when Grace told her ridiculous jokes in sign language, when they played games together, when life was good and full of joy instead of medical emergencies and crushing fear. Grace's hand started shaking so badly, she nearly dropped the plates. She set them down carefully on her tray and forced herself to breathe. Don't break down. Don't make a scene. Don't. Excuse me. Nathan's voice was polite, concerned. Grace looked up and realized he was speaking to her. Are you all right? You look pale. I'm fine, Grace said automatically. Her voice sounded strange, too high, too tight. Just sorry. I'll get out of your way. But before she could leave, Nathan's daughter signed something. Her hands moved in fluid, practiced motions, and Grace understood every word even though she hadn't signed in 3 years, even though she tried so hard to forget this language. Is the lady sick? She looked sad. Nathan translated for his daughter, still looking at Grace with concern. My daughter Emma wants to know if you're feeling okay. Emma. Her name was Emma. Grace looked at the little girl, at her kind eyes and concerned expression, and something inside her completely shattered. Because Vivian would have done the same thing, would have noticed someone in distress and worried about them, would have shown that same gentle compassion despite being just a child. I'm fine, Grace repeated, but her voice cracked on the words. I'm sorry. I need to. She turned to leave, but her hands betrayed her. Without thinking, without meaning to, Grace signed back to Emma. Her hands formed the words automatically, muscle memory taking over after 3 years of disuse. Thank you for asking. You're very kind. Emma's face lit up with surprise and delight. She signed back, her movements excited and rapid. You know sign language. My dad is still learning. Do you sign a lot? And Grace couldn't do it. Couldn't maintain the pretense. Couldn't keep the walls up. Couldn't pretend this wasn't destroying her. She looked at Emma's happy, expectant face, and all she could see was Vivian. Vivian at 12, the age she'd never reach. Vivian excited about meeting another signer. Vivian full of life and joy and infinite possibility. I'm sorry, Grace whispered, her voice breaking completely. I can't, I have to go. She abandoned her tray and fled across the ballroom, barely registering Michelle's startled expression as she passed. She made it to the staff area, grabbed her coat and purse from her locker, and walked out into the cold December night without looking back. She'd just quit her job. She'd blown her only chance at making rent. She'd made a scene in front of her employer and probably burned any future opportunities with Sterling Events. But none of that mattered because she couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't function through the wave of grief that was drowning her. Grace walked for blocks, crying in the freezing air, not caring where she was going. Eventually she found herself in a small park, sitting on a bench under a streetlight, shaking with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her core. Vivian would be 12, would have been 12, would have had Emma's confidence and joy, would have been excited about Christmas and school and all the normal things 12-year-olds cared about. But Vivian was gone, and Grace was alone, and seeing Emma had ripped open every carefully sealed wound Grace had spent 3 years trying to heal. She didn't know how long she sat there. Long enough for the cold to seep through her coat, for her tears to freeze on her cheeks, for exhaustion to replace the sharp edge of grief with dull, empty numbness. Finally, Grace forced herself to stand up, to start the long walk back to her apartment, to face whatever came next. She'd figure out the rent somehow. She'd find another job. She'd survive this the way she'd survived everything else, by putting one foot in front of the other and refusing to give up, even when giving up seemed like the easier option. But as Grace walked home through the dark, quiet streets, she couldn't shake the image of Emma's smile. Couldn't stop hearing that silent laugh. Couldn't forget the way signing with a deaf child again had felt like coming home after 3 years in exile. What Grace didn't know was that back at the ballroom, Nathan Hartman was asking questions, asking who the server was who'd signed with his daughter, asking why she'd left so abruptly, asking if anyone knew how to reach her, because Nathan had seen something in Grace's face when she looked at Emma, something more than surprise or politeness, something that looked like recognition and grief and love all tangled together. And he wanted to understand what it meant. Emma had been talking about the signing lady nonstop since Grace left, kept asking when she'd come back, whether she'd sign more, whether they could be friends. It was the most animated Emma had been at a work event ever, and Nathan wasn't about to let that go without investigation. Michelle, flustered and apologetic, explained that the server's name was Grace Miller, that she'd worked for Sterling Events for about 18 months, that she'd always been professional and reliable until tonight's unexpected departure. Michelle didn't have much more information, just a phone number and an address for emergency contact purposes. Nathan shouldn't have cared. He had 200 employees and their families to think about, a company to run, a daughter to raise. One server's personal crisis wasn't his concern or his business. But something about the way Grace had looked at Emma, the raw pain in her eyes, the automatic fluency of her signing despite obvious distress, made him curious, made him want to understand. The next morning, Grace woke up to 3 missed calls from Michelle and a voicemail that was equal parts concerned and annoyed. "Grace, I need you to call me back. Mr. Hartman, the CEO, is asking about you. I don't know what happened last night, but we need to talk. Please call me." Grace deleted the message without listening to it twice. She couldn't go back to Sterling Events, couldn't risk seeing Emma again, couldn't handle the questions that would inevitably come. Better to cut ties cleanly, find a different catering company to work for, move on with her life. She spent the weekend applying for new jobs, trying not to think about rent due in 3 days or the $140 she'd lost by walking out of Friday's event. She avoided her phone, avoided thinking about Emma's smile or Nathan's concerned expression or the way signing again had felt both wonderful and agonizing. Monday morning brought another complication. Grace was leaving her apartment building when she nearly collided with someone standing outside her door. Nathan Hartman, in an expensive overcoat and polished shoes, looking completely out of place in her rundown building's dingy hallway. "Mr. Hartman," Grace said, shocked. "What are you? How did you?" "I got your address from Sterling Events," Nathan said. His voice was apologetic but determined. "I know this is highly unusual, probably inappropriate, but I need to talk to you, and you weren't returning calls." Grace's first instinct was to tell him to leave, to close the door in his face, to protect herself from whatever this conversation would bring. But something in his expression, genuine concern, not anger or accusation, made her pause. "About Friday night," Nathan continued. "About Emma. She hasn't stopped talking about you. About the lady who signed with her. And I saw your face when you looked at my daughter. I saw—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I saw grief. Real deep grief. And I think I know why." Grace felt her throat tighten. "You don't know anything about me." "No," Nathan agreed. "But I'd like to, if you're willing to talk." There was a long silence. Grace stood in her doorway. This wealthy CEO stood in her hallway, and the gap between their worlds felt insurmountable. What could she possibly say to him? How could she explain that seeing his daughter had torn open wounds he couldn't begin to understand? But something in his eyes, kindness, maybe, or genuine care, made her take a risk. "There's a coffee shop 2 blocks from here," Grace said quietly. "I get off work at noon. If you still want to talk, I'll meet you there." Nathan nodded. "I'll be there. Thank you." Grace went to her morning shift at the coffee shop in a daze. Her mind kept circling back to Nathan's words. "I think I know why." What did he know? What had he guessed? And why did he care enough to track her down at her apartment? At noon, Grace walked to the coffee shop. Not the one where she worked, but a different one, quieter, where she wouldn't be recognized. Nathan was already there, sitting at a corner table with 2 cups of coffee. He stood when she approached. "I ordered you a coffee," he said. "Black, no sugar. Michelle mentioned that's how you took it at events. I hope that's okay." Grace sat down, wrapping her cold hands around the warm cup. "Why are you here, Mr. Hartman?" "Nathan, please." He settled back into his seat, looking uncertain in a way that seemed foreign to someone in his position. "And I'm here because my daughter asked me to find you. She wanted to know why the signing lady left, whether she'd done something wrong, whether you'd come back." Grace felt tears prick at her eyes. "She didn't do anything wrong." "I know, but I don't think I can explain that to Emma without understanding what happened." Nathan paused. "Grace, may I call you Grace? You signed with my daughter like someone who's fluent, not someone who took a class or learned it casually. Your hands moved like signing was your first language, not your second. And when you looked at Emma, you didn't see a deaf child. You saw someone specific, someone you'd lost." The tears Grace had been holding back started falling. She couldn't stop them, couldn't maintain her composure, couldn't pretend Nathan's guess wasn't accurate. Her name was Vivian, she whispered. My daughter. She was deaf. She died 3 years ago. Heart condition. She was 9 years old. Nathan's expression shifted to something Grace recognized, the particular kind of sorrow that comes from understanding loss. I'm so sorry. She would be 12 now, Grace continued, the words pouring out now that the dam had broken. Same age as Emma. Same energy, same smile, same joy in signing. When I saw your daughter Friday night, when I heard her laugh, her voice broke. I saw Vivian. Everything I'd lost. Everything she'd never get to be. That must have been unbearable, Nathan said quietly. I haven't signed with anyone since Vivian died. I couldn't. It hurt too much. Every sign reminded me of her, of everything we'd shared, of the conversations we'd never have. So I avoided it. Avoided the deaf community, avoided other signers, built walls around that entire part of my life. Grace wiped at her tears. And then Friday night, Emma signed to me, and I responded without thinking. 3 years of avoiding my daughter's language, and I broke in 5 seconds because your daughter was kind to me. Nathan was quiet for a long moment. Emma was born deaf, he said finally. Genetic hearing loss, complete and permanent. Her mother, my ex-wife, couldn't handle it. Left when Emma was 2. Said she didn't sign up for a special needs child. Didn't want the challenges. Didn't want to learn sign language or deal with doctors or any of it. His voice was matter-of-fact, but Grace could hear the old pain underneath. So it's been Emma and me since she was a toddler. Learning ASL together, navigating the deaf community, figuring out how to be the parent she deserved. You're doing a good job, Grace said. I could see that. The way you sign with her, the way you include her. Vivian would have loved having a father like you. Thank you. But I'm not telling you this to fish for compliments. Nathan leaned forward. I'm telling you because I understand, at least a little, what it's like to love a deaf child, to learn their language, to make their world your world. And I can't imagine losing that. Can't imagine how devastated I'd be if I lost Emma. Grace nodded, unable to speak through the tightness in her throat. Emma needs more deaf role models, Nathan continued. More people who sign fluently, who understand her world. She has teachers and therapists, but most of them are hearing people who learned ASL as adults. She needs to see deaf adults thriving, succeeding, living full lives. And she needs, he paused, she needs more people who love her enough to learn her language, who see her as Emma, not as the deaf kid. She's lucky to have you, Grace said. And I think, Nathan said carefully, that you might benefit from spending time with a deaf child again. Not as a replacement for Vivian, nothing could replace her, but as a way to heal. To remember why you learned ASL in the first place. To honor your daughter's memory by using the language she taught you. Grace stared at him. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that maybe we can help each other, Nathan said. Emma wants to know you, wants to sign with you. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, that you might need to reconnect with the deaf community, with signing, with the part of yourself that was Vivian's mother. I don't know if I can, Grace whispered. Every time I sign, every time I see a deaf child, I think of everything I've lost. It's too painful. I understand. And if you say no, I'll respect that. I'll tell Emma you had to move away for work, or whatever explanation makes sense. But Grace, Nathan's voice was gentle but firm. You can't run from grief forever. Eventually, you have to face it. And maybe facing it doesn't mean forgetting Vivian. Maybe it means celebrating what she gave you. The language, the love, the ability to connect with people like Emma who need someone like you in their lives. Grace closed her eyes. She thought about Vivian's laugh, about the years of signing together, about all the joy that had existed before the grief. She thought about Emma's smile, about the automatic way her hands had formed signs Friday night, about how right it had felt despite the pain. I'm not a role model, Grace said. I'm broke. I'm barely surviving. I live in a terrible apartment, and I work 2 minimum wage jobs, and I have debt I'll never pay off. I'm not someone Emma should look up to. You're a mother who loved her deaf daughter enough to learn an entire language for her, Nathan said. You're someone who's survived unspeakable loss and kept going. You're fluent in ASL, and you clearly understand deaf culture. That makes you exactly the kind of person Emma needs to know. There was a long silence. Grace felt like she was standing at a crossroads, faced with a choice that would determine everything that came next. She could say no, walk away, keep the walls intact, continue surviving in her safe, lonely, grief-contained world. Or she could say yes, risk the pain, open herself up to connections that might heal her or might break her further. I don't know if I can do this, Grace said, but maybe I could try. Just once. See Emma again. Sign with her. See if I can handle it without falling apart. Nathan's face broke into a smile. That's all I'm asking. One chance. And Grace, whatever happens, however it goes, thank you for considering it. They made arrangements. Saturday afternoon, neutral territory, a park Emma liked, where she could play and they could talk without the pressure of Nathan's home or Grace's apartment. Grace left the coffee shop feeling terrified and hopeful in equal measure. The week passed in a blur of anxiety and second-guessing. Grace almost canceled a dozen times. Almost texted Nathan to say she couldn't do it, couldn't handle seeing Emma again, couldn't risk the emotional devastation. But something stopped her. Maybe curiosity. Maybe the memory of how right it had felt to sign again, even through the pain. Maybe just the desperate hope that Nathan was right, that facing her grief might be the path to healing. Saturday arrived cold and bright. Grace dressed carefully, casual but neat, wanting to make a good impression even though she told herself it didn't matter. She arrived at the park 15 minutes early and found a bench where she could watch the playground. Her heart was racing. Her hands were shaking. She almost turned around and left. Then Emma arrived, holding Nathan's hand, her face lighting up when she saw Grace. She waved enthusiastically, then signed. You came. I thought maybe you wouldn't come. Grace's hands moved automatically, responding before her fear could stop her. I promised I would. It's good to see you again, Emma. And just like that, 3 years of walls came tumbling down. Emma ran over, chattering in sign language about her week, about school, about the new book she was reading. Nathan followed more slowly, giving them space but staying close enough to supervise. And Grace signed back, her hands remembering movements she'd thought were buried forever, her face forming the expressions that were such a crucial part of ASL, her heart cracking open with every gesture. Emma was different from Vivian, more outgoing, more confident, less cautious. But she had the same spark, the same joy in communication, the same beautiful fluency that came from growing up in 2 languages. And as Grace signed with her, she felt something shift inside her chest. The pain was still there, would always be there, but alongside it was something else, something that felt almost like joy. They spent 2 hours in the park. Emma showed Grace her favorite playground equipment, taught her new signs she'd learned in school, asked a million questions about Grace's life, and whether she knew other deaf people, and what her favorite foods were. Nathan stayed mostly quiet, translating when necessary for his own understanding, but letting Grace and Emma communicate directly. At one point, Emma asked a question Grace had been dreading. Why do you know sign language so well? Most hearing people don't sign like you do. Grace looked at Nathan, who nodded encouragement. She took a breath and signed. I had a daughter. She was deaf, like you. I learned sign language, so we could talk to each other. She died a few years ago, but I still remember everything we shared. Emma's eyes went wide. You had a deaf daughter? What was her name? Vivian. That's a pretty name. Emma was quiet for a moment, her expression thoughtful. Then she signed. I bet Vivian was lucky to have a mom who learned to sign. My friend Kayla's parents don't sign at all. She has to use interpreters to talk to them. That seems sad. Your dad signs with you, Grace pointed out. That's special. I know. He's still learning, but he tries really hard. Emma smiled. Do you think Vivian would want you to be friends with me, since we're both deaf? The question hit Grace like a physical blow. Would Vivian want this? Grace thought about her daughter's generous heart, her enthusiasm for meeting other deaf children, her excitement about the deaf community. Yes, Grace signed, tears streaming down her face. I think she would like that very much. Emma hugged her then, a fierce, spontaneous embrace that broke Grace's heart and healed it simultaneously. Nathan looked away politely, giving them a moment of privacy, and Grace held this child who wasn't hers, would never be hers, but who somehow represented everything beautiful about the language and community Vivian had introduced her to. When Emma finally pulled back, she signed with absolute seriousness. I'm sorry your daughter died, but I'm glad you know sign language, because now we can be friends. Okay. Grace signed back, smiling through tears. Friends. That was the beginning. Over the following weeks, Grace became a regular presence in Emma's life. Not as a replacement parent. Nathan made that boundary very clear, and Grace respected it completely. But as a mentor, a friend, someone who understood Emma's world from the inside. They met at the park, at museums, at deaf community events Nathan wanted Emma to experience. Grace taught Emma new signs, shared stories about deaf culture, helped her navigate situations where being deaf felt isolating. And slowly, gradually, Grace started to heal. Not because Emma replaced Vivian. Nothing could do that, but because signing again, being part of the deaf community again, remembering why she'd learned this beautiful language, helped Grace reconnect with the part of herself that had been Vivian's mother. She started attending deaf events again, started reaching out to old friends from the community she'd abandoned after Vivian's death, started using her hands to communicate instead of keeping them silent and still. Nathan helped too, in ways Grace hadn't expected. He'd noticed her financial struggles, had probably guessed from her address and her multiple jobs and the worn quality of her clothes. He'd offer her a position at Hartman Technologies, something part-time and flexible that wouldn't interfere with her relationship with Emma, but would provide stable income and benefits. Grace had refused at first, unwilling to accept what felt like charity. But Nathan had insisted it wasn't charity, it was gratitude. Emma was thriving with Grace in her life, more confident and happy than she'd been in years. Eventually, Grace accepted. The job was simple, administrative work, scheduling, organizing events, but it paid better than both her previous jobs combined. For the first time in 3 years, Grace could pay rent without panic, could buy groceries without calculating every penny, could breathe without the constant weight of financial crisis crushing her. On the first anniversary of meeting Emma, a year after that Christmas party that had changed everything, Grace visited Vivian's grave. She brought flowers, the purple ones Vivian had loved, and she signed to her daughter, her hands moving in the quiet cemetery, forming words only she and Vivian would have understood. I met a little girl. Grace signed to the gravestone. Her name is Emma. She's deaf, like you were. She's 12, the age you should be. She's smart and funny and kind, and I think you would have been friends. The wind rustled through the trees. Grace kept signing. I'm using the language you taught me, baby. I'm part of the community again. I'm not hiding anymore from the best parts of what we shared. And I hope, that you'd be happy about that. That you'd want me to sign with Emma and help her and be part of her life. Grace knelt down, placing the flowers gently against the headstone. I still miss you every single day. I still wish you were here. But I'm learning how to live with the grief instead of drowning in it. I'm learning that loving you and loving my life now don't have to be opposites. She signed, I love you, the 3-part gesture that had been their special phrase, the last thing Grace had signed to Vivian before she died. Thank you for teaching me to sign, Grace finished. Thank you for showing me how to love someone completely. Thank you for being my daughter. I'll carry you with me always. Grace stood up, wiped her tears, and walked back to her car. That evening, she was having dinner with Nathan and Emma. It was a normal part of her life now. These casual meals together, the easy companionship that had developed between the 3 of them. Not a family. Exactly. The boundaries were clear, but something meaningful nonetheless. Over dinner, Emma signed about school, about her friends, about the deaf youth group she'd joined. Nathan translated the parts Grace missed, though she needed less and less translation these days. And Grace participated fully, her hands moving with the fluency that had come back after a year of practice, her face animated with the expressions ASL required. At one point, Nathan caught Grace's eye and signed something meant just for her. "Thank you for giving Emma this gift, for being who you are." Grace signed back. "Thank you for giving me a reason to sign again, for helping me heal." Emma, noticing the private exchange, demanded to know what they were saying. Nathan laughed and translated, and Emma hugged Grace with the easy affection of a child who'd learned to trust. Later, driving home to her apartment, a better apartment now, in a safer neighborhood, with heat that actually worked, Grace thought about the journey, from that Christmas party to this moment, about the grief that had nearly destroyed her and the unexpected connections that had pulled her back to life, about Vivian, always Vivian, whose death had broken Grace's world, but whose life had given Grace something precious, the language that connected her to Emma, the skills that allowed her to help this child thrive, the capacity to love even through devastating loss. Grace would never stop missing Vivian, would never stop wishing for the years they'd been cheated out of. But she was learning to hold the grief and the gratitude simultaneously, to honor Vivian's memory not by shutting down, but by using what Vivian had taught her to make a difference in another child's life. Emma wasn't a replacement, could never be a replacement, but she was a gift nonetheless, a reminder that the language Grace and Vivian had shared wasn't meant to die with Vivian. It was meant to be used, celebrated, passed forward to the next generation of deaf children who needed hearing allies fluent enough to bridge two worlds. On Christmas Eve, exactly 1 year after the party where everything changed, Grace attended Hartman Technologies' holiday celebration. This time, she wasn't working. She was there as a guest, at Emma's insistence, wearing a dress Emma had helped her pick out. The ballroom looked the same: white lights, silver decorations, elegant tables. But Grace's experience was completely different. She sat at table 7 with Nathan and Emma. She signed throughout dinner, laughed at Emma's jokes, helped translate for other guests who were curious about sign language. When Nathan gave his annual speech, he introduced Grace to the company, not by name, not with details, but with a simple acknowledgement. "This past year, my daughter made a friend who changed our lives. Someone who taught us that the greatest gifts often come from unexpected places, in languages we're still learning to speak." Emma grabbed Grace's hand and squeezed, her eyes shining. Grace squeezed back, her heart full in a way she'd thought was impossible after Vivian's death. Later, when the party was winding down, Emma signed to Grace, "I'm glad you came to last year's party. I'm glad you didn't stay away forever. I'm glad we're friends." "Me too." Grace signed back, "Me too, sweetheart." And she meant it. Despite the pain, despite the grief, despite everything it had cost her to walk back into a world that reminded her so much of what she'd lost, Grace was glad. Glad she'd found the courage to sign again. Glad she'd met Emma. Glad she discovered that healing didn't mean forgetting, and moving forward didn't mean leaving Vivian behind. That night, as Grace drove home through streets decorated with Christmas lights, she thought about the question she'd been asking herself for 3 years. How do you survive losing the person you love most in the world? She still didn't have a perfect answer, but she'd learned this much. You survive by honoring what they gave you, by using the gifts they left behind, the languages they taught you, the love they showed you, the capacity for connection they awakened in you. You survive by opening yourself to new relationships that don't replace the old ones, but honor them by continuing the legacy of love. Vivian had taught Grace to sign, to communicate across difference, to love someone completely despite challenges. And now Grace was using those lessons to help Emma, to support Nathan, to be part of a community that had once been her entire world and could be again. It wasn't the life Grace had planned, wasn't the future she'd imagined when Vivian was alive, but it was a life worth living, a life that honored Vivian's memory instead of being consumed by her loss. And sometimes, when Emma laughed that silent, joyful laugh, Grace could almost hear Vivian laughing too, not because Emma replaced her daughter, but because both girls shared that same beautiful spark, that same capacity for joy despite challenges, that same ability to connect through a language that transcended sound. Grace would carry Vivian with her always, in every sign she made, in every conversation with Emma, in every moment she chose connection over isolation, love over fear, Healing over endless grief. That was Vivian's final gift to her mother. The knowledge that love doesn't end with death. It transforms, continues, finds new expressions. And if you're brave enough to stay open to it, love can pull you back from the darkest places and give you reasons to smile again. Even on Christmas Eve, surrounded by lights and laughter, and a little girl whose sign language reminded Grace of everything she'd lost and everything she'd found. Even then, especially then, Grace could feel Vivian's presence. Not as pain this time, but as blessing. "Thank you." Grace signed silently to her daughter, wherever she was. "Thank you for everything you gave me. I'm using it well. I promise." And somewhere, in whatever place held the spirits of children gone too soon, Grace liked to believe Vivian was smiling. So here's my question for you. Have you ever experienced a loss so devastating that you thought you'd never recover? And if something unexpected opened a path to healing, even painful healing, would you have the courage to walk it? Think about that. And if Grace's story touched you, I'd love to hear your thoughts below.